Selling the family home in retirement triggers real grief responses that are really underestimated by advisors, agents, and retirees themselves. Research consistently documents that seniors experience grief symptoms in more than 70% of the downsizing decisions they make. So the home is just not a property. For many, home ownership defines who they are via their home. It's not just a place to live. For most, it's their identity, and it's full of memories. Here in Ontario, where families have often lived in the same home 20, 30, maybe even 40 years through substantial appreciation, the emotional weight of selling is compounded by the knowledge that this is it, the last big financial move. So in this video, I want to talk about what's actually happening underneath their delay. What research shows about the emotional weight of selling the home you raised your family in. Why the way the industry frames this decision makes things harder for you, and what you can actually do with this information, whether you're thinking about moving in a year or even in 5 years. I work with empty nesters here in Guelph, Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge areas, and I help people move through the downsizing process using my 5-step Your Next Chapter method. And what I see often are thoughtful, capable people who know what the logical next move is and who still feel completely stuck. Not because they lack information, not because they haven't done the research, but because the emotional reality of leaving a home you've lived in for, say, 25 years doesn't respond to logic. And nobody is telling them that's completely normal. I want to read to you some real questions that people have been searching for answers to, because they say something I couldn't say as clearly myself. So here's the first one. We've been in our house for 32 years. My husband says we should sell. I cannot imagine leaving. How do other couples work through this? Here's another one. Is it normal to feel like you're losing part of yourself when you sell the house you raised your family in? I did not expect to feel this way. And another one, we want to downsize, but neither of us can face going through 40 years of stuff. Has anyone else actually done this? How do you start? And the last one, at what age should we realistically start thinking about selling? Are we too early? Are we already too late? These aren't questions about interest rates or market timing. These are questions about identity, about loss, about what happens to a person when the home that they've held their life in for 30 years gets sold to someone they've never met. They're being asked by thousands of people every single week. There is a survey from CARP, the Canadian Association of Retired Persons, and they found that 96% of Canadian seniors want to stay in their own homes as they age. That's 96%. That number alone tells you something important. Staying is almost always the emotional preference. The question is whether that preference is based on reality or something harder to name. Research published in the UK-based journal called PsychReg looked at what researchers call residential identity in older adults, and they found that 47% of people who moved from a long-term home reported significant sense of identity loss. And 77% described strong emotional attachment to the home they were leaving. So the Journal of Housing for Elderly has also documented grief responses as a consistent finding across downsizing research. Not occasional, consistent. So now think about what that actually means. Well, the couples who keep changing the subject when this comes up are not being irrational. They're protecting themselves from something that feels like a real loss, because it is a real loss. And until that gets named out loud, it doesn't go anywhere. Here's the part the real estate industry, including myself at times, has gotten backwards. The industry calls downsizing right-sizing. The brochures use words like liberating. And for many people, eventually, it genuinely is those words. But the first-person accounts that surface months later in newspaper features and online forum discussions tell a much more complicated story. Loss and grief happening at the same time. Regret sitting right alongside freedom, missing what was, even when the new life is genuinely good. The optimistic language reaches people before the move. The honest accounts surface after. That gap is where most people get stuck. So I work, as I say, in Guelph and Waterloo region, and who are in this exact situation. Many of them are in their 60s, 70s, even 80s, and they've been in their homes for 20 plus years, and they own outright or close to it, and they're trying to figure out what the next chapter actually looks like. So my focus isn't just the sale, it's also the planning that happens before and during and even after the sign goes on the lawn. Imagine this situation. A couple has been in their Guelph home for, let's say, 34 years. The kids grew up there. Grandkids have been coming for holidays since they were born. The basement holds 34 years of life and memories. Hockey gear from the late 90s, or a sewing machine that belonged to a mother who passed away years ago, or even Christmas decorations in boxes that haven't been opened in years. Or maybe it's tools that nobody uses anymore, but nobody can let go of either. This couple knows they should be thinking about a move. One partner has a need that's becoming a real concern, and the property taxes are significant. The house needs work they don't really want to take on, but every time the conversation comes up, one of them quietly changes the subject, and both of them let that drop. And so it's not dysfunction that's happening, it's protection. For a generation that defined itself through home ownership, the house is the physical proof that the life happened. The children grew up here, the holidays happened here, the neighbors became friends here, and selling it means dismantling the evidence. That is the operating system underneath almost every times I hear we're not ready yet. Not logic, not timing, not the market, the fear that if we sell this house, we lose the proof of who we were. One of those questions I read earlier is worth spending a few minutes on. And it's, our kids grew up here and our grandkids love coming to visit. And if we downsize to a condo, where does everyone sleep at Christmas? How do other families deal with this? This is a common concern. You've been the one hosting all these years, and moving brings up questions, and it deserves an honest answer. Most families who downsize find that holidays look different afterward. Not worse, just different. Some families start rotating. For instance, one adult child hosts one year, maybe another hosts the next year. The grandparents come as guests instead of managing the whole event and Christmas celebrations themselves. Some people put the money they save from lower housing costs towards renting a cottage for a week over the holidays rather than maintaining a large home all year for those few visits. Some make it work in a 2-bedroom condo with, a good pull-out sofa and a couple of air mattresses, and their grandkids think it's an adventure. Or you can use party rooms at the building to do the hosting. None of these is a perfect solution, I realize, but they are all very workable. The honest question worth asking is this: how many nights a year is that extra space actually being used? And what does it cost to heat, maintain, insure, and even clean the rest of the house for the other, let's say, 350 days of the year? I'm not saying the answer is obvious. I'm saying the real trade-off is worth being honest about. So let me now say something about the 40 years of stuff, because it's one of the biggest reasons people stay frozen. The items that are hardest to let go of are never the valuable ones. They're the ones the people that have attachment to that are no longer here. A parent's dishes, a husband's tools, maybe it's a grandmother's jewelry that nobody wears, but nobody can really give it away yet. Or maybe it's even letting go of an object can feel like letting go of that person it belonged to. That's what's actually happening underneath the resistance. Not attachment to the dish, it's the attachment to the connection the dish represents. The fear isn't losing the thing, the fear is forgetting the person. What I see work for people who actually get through this, they don't start with the hardest things, they start with the obvious ones. Maybe it's the sports equipment from 10 years ago that hasn't been used in 10 years, or maybe it's appliances that stopped working, or books that nobody will read again and want. They build momentum. I call it building a decluttering muscle. They prove to themselves that letting go doesn't mean forgetting. And by the time they get to the harder decision, they've already moved through dozens of smaller ones. They've already shown themselves it's survivable to do this process. And it is definitely a process. It doesn't have to be done all at once, and it doesn't have to be done perfectly. You just have to get started. That's the key. So let me talk about timing, because are we too early or are we already too late is a valid question. There is no perfect age, but there is a pattern that shows up consistently. The moves that go best are the ones where both people, were part of the decision, where the conversation happened before there was a real reason to rush this decision, where there was time to sort through things without pressure, where the couple chose their next chapter together instead of being forced into whatever happened to be available. The moves that go hardest are the ones driven by a health event or some other event, some other crisis. When one person is suddenly managing everything alone, when there's no time to think, when every decision feels like a loss or loss on top of loss. You know, Bloom Finance, a Canadian resource focused on financial decisions for older adults, has noted that retirees consistently underestimate how long they'll wait before moving and underestimate the practical costs of staying too long. So deferred maintenance, physical difficulty managing the property, growing isolation as the neighborhood changes around them. The comfortable window is the one where both partners are healthy and able to participate in a real decision together. That window is real, and it tends to be shorter than most people actually want to believe. That doesn't mean you need to sell now. It means the conversation is worth having now. Here's what I want you to take from all of this. If anything I've described sounds familiar, you're not unusual. You're not behind, and you're definitely not being irrational. What you're feeling is documented, and it's consistent and completely normal. The logical case for selling cannot compete with the emotional case for staying in a house that you have so many memories in. Not until the grief underneath really gets acknowledged. That's not a weakness. That's just how this works for most people. And the conversation is worth having before there's a real reason to rush and make a rash decision or be forced into something. Not a conversation about listings or prices. It's a conversation about what you actually want the next chapter to look like. What do you want your days to feel like? What matters most to you now at this stage of life? Not at the stage you were when you first bought the house all those years ago. The people who move well through this are not the ones who felt no grief. They are the ones that let themselves say it out loud. They said out loud, "This is hard. I'm not sure. I'm going to feel something when we do go through all of this." They weren't certain. They weren't without loss. They just chose to move through it with their eyes open instead of waiting until the choice was made for them. And I don't want that for you. There is a real difference between choosing your next chapter and having circumstances choose it for you. I'll see you in the next video.